Hi, it's Mr. Ramage, and this video lesson is going to focus on immigration during the progressive era of American history. And we're going to examine some issues surrounding immigration and some actions the United States took in order to limit the amount of people coming to our country. For the purposes of this lesson, I'm going to be utilizing this standard from the state of Ohio, which states immigration, internal migration, and urbanization transformed American life. Our focus here today on this lesson is going to be on the immigration piece. So in the period of time after the Civil War leading up to World War I, America saw a huge influx of people drawn to the United States by the tremendous amount of opportunity that America's industrialization had presented. So around 25 million people will be migrating to the United States, mostly from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from Canada, Latin America, and Asia. Now, what is causing immigrants to leave their countries? Well, in terms of immigration, we typically talk about push factors and pull factors. So a push factor would be an issue in their homeland that made them want to leave in the first place, something that is pushing them out. Anything from wars and violence to religious persecution, the lack of opportunities, discrimination, the lack of jobs and decent wages, no access to their own land to farm, as well as a lack of social mobility. These would all be factors that would push people to leave their homeland and go find opportunity elsewhere. Well, what would be the pull factors here in the United States? A pull factor would be an advantage a foreign country has over your homeland, something that would make you want to leave, like living in a peaceful place free of war and violence and persecution. Religious freedom to practice openly, to have access to opportunities for yourselves and for your children, job opportunities, the ability to make a good living and decent wages, the opportunity to own your own land and to grow and to prosper that way, and especially social mobility, something that the United States always prided itself on, that you were able to move up in society. So in terms of immigration, we have pull factors and push factors. The main ports of entry to the United States would have been Ellis Island on the East Coast and Angel Island on the West Coast. And in terms of immigration, America is going to go through certain waves of immigration. We're going to go back a little bit and talk about the quote-unquote old immigrants coming to the United States during the early 1800s, so pre-Civil War. And most of the people coming to the United States during this period of time would be from Western Europe. And most of them, not all, but most of them would be considered white. Most of them were English speaking. Most of them were Protestant Christians, non-Catholics. Many of them were skilled workers and had a trade. Many of them were literate and knew how to read and write. Many of them did come with some money. Many of them traveled here and migrated here with their families, so we had a family unit, a family structure coming to the United States. And many of these old immigrants assimilated quickly. They blended in with American society. They adopted American customs and traditions and culture, and especially adopted the language. So these old immigrants were welcomed because they looked very similar to the people currently living in the United States. Well, that is not going to be the case when we talk about this new wave of immigration after the Civil War, this period from 1865 to 1914. Okay, so again, assimilation is an important factor, and these old immigrants would assimilate into American culture faster than these new immigrants. So this different period of immigration emerges in the 1860s into the early 1900s. So these new immigrants don't look or act like the previous immigrants coming to the United States. Many of them would be considered to be non-white. Most were non-English speaking. The majority were Catholic or Orthodox Christians, non-Protestant Christians. Many were Jewish, or many were unskilled workers who were not trained in a specific craft or trade. Many were illiterate. Instead of coming over as a family unit, many of them were single men and were less likely to assimilate, and many were coming over rather poor. They didn't bring a lot of wealth with them. Much of their wealth went to paying for their trip from Europe to the United States. So we have quite a different type of immigrant coming to the United States, and to native white Americans, this was very scary and very troublesome that there were so many different people coming to the United States. So nativist attitudes here in America are going to emerge due to this influx of people who are different. And nativism refers to a policy or a belief that protects or favors the interest of the native population over the interests of others. So nativism becomes a very strong attitude in the United States. It's one we've had to deal with pretty much throughout our history. And nativism is going to be rooted very deeply in stereotypes and prejudices, as well as misinformation and myths. There's simply things about these people we are being told that are untrue, and that are based on all sorts of misinformation and myths. Now, in terms of stereotypes and prejudices, those are always constant in our culture, sometimes stronger than others, and in some people stronger than others. And a stereotype is a real or imagined difference that exists between two groups of people. It could be a difference in religion or language or dress, the types of food people eat, the beliefs that they may have, their values and customs, or even based on their physical appearance. Nativist attitudes also come because of economic threats that may be perceived, that immigrants are coming to the United States and taking jobs because they're willing to work for lower wages. And typically, nativist attitudes also involve some type of scapegoating, looking at a group of people or an individual person and blaming them for something that really has nothing to do with them. So again, I bring this up not to want to spend a ton of time on this, but we do need to kind of understand what's happening with the country's attitudes and what this nativism looks like and might feel like or might sound like. We can see evidence of these nativist attitudes in political cartoons from back in this time period. For example, here we have a cartoon from 1903 depicting immigrants from Europe literally as rats. And if you examine this image a little bit more closely, we can see right there, direct from the slums of Europe daily. And it's dumping these rats with human faces out here on the coast of the United States as Uncle Sam stands by, clutching the flagpole with the American flag. We can see on these immigrant rats, we have hats and bandanas that say things like socialist and anarchist and mafia. They're holding daggers in their teeth and revolvers that say things like assassination and things like that. So that cartoon shows us really this fear and this threat that these immigrants are bringing to the United States. Now, this cartoon has a slightly different take on the issue of immigration. This is published in Puck magazine in 1893, and it's titled Looking Backward. And in this cartoon, we can see a group of which appear to be wealthy American businessmen or business owners. You can tell by the way they dress and their clothes that they are probably wealthy people. We see an immigrant walking down the gangplank off of a ship with all of his baggage on his person, and then the hands up from the gentleman in the middle, probably telling him to stop, maybe to go back. But in the background of this image are the shadows of these Americans, and if you look at the shadows, they all appear to be immigrants. So the cartoon's talking about the descendants, right? Like your grandfather or great-grandfather was an immigrant like this guy coming off the boat. So maybe we need to take a minute to look backward and appreciate where we came from and how we came to be here, and maybe not be so harsh on this guy who's just trying to do what your parents or grandparents did. This cartoon I really like because it really looks at the immigrant from all sorts of different points of view, and you can try to get a grasp of how the immigrant issue is being seen by other groups here in the United States. This cartoon is from Judge Magazine, and the caption for this cartoon is, "The immigrant, is he an acquisition or is he a detriment? Is he a good thing for our country? Is he a bad thing for our country?" And then the cartoon examines different points of view. So if we look here to the right side of the cartoon, we see a politician, a local politician, and he's holding up a little piece of paper that says, "He makes votes for me." So yes, this is something that would be commonplace. Local politicians would go into immigrant communities and do what they could to try to win the votes of the immigrants, finding them a place to live, finding them a job, getting them some food. It was a great way for local politicians to secure some votes from the immigrant population. So local politicians are happy that this immigrant is here. To the statesman, to the left of the politician, his sign says, "He's a puzzle to me," holding his chin sort of in a thinking posture. So we're not quite sure maybe at the state level what the immigrant is. Compared to the local level, there's a little bit of apprehension here. Now, if we examine the other components of this cartoon, we see a health inspector with his little fumigating pump here, and on his little briefcase he has, it says, "He brings disease." So this would be looking at the immigrant as a dirty person coming to our country, bringing disease, again, a stereotype of immigrants, that they are bringing all the negative things here, including disease and terribleness to America. Next to him is the working man, which you can see on his apron, his square hat, as well as the hammer. And he's holding up a sign that says, "He cheapens my labor." And he's grabbing onto the pant leg of the immigrant. And he's drawn very small, which might be an indication of the weakness of the working class people. But on the sign it says, "He cheapens my labor," meaning that organized labor believed that as long as immigrants were coming here and willing to work for low wages, then all wages would remain low. Americans who are trying very hard to form labor unions and trying very hard to get raises and higher wages are not going to be successful as long as immigrants come to America and reduce those wages by working for low wages. So the point of view of the labor union is that immigrant workers cheapen their labor. If we go to the opposite side of the image, we see this little citizen guy standing here with his arms folded. And on his paper it says, "He is a menace." So from the point of view of maybe American citizens, the immigrant is seen as a menace, a troublemaker, a bad thing that's coming into our country. In front of him is a contractor, a business owner, if you will. And on his sign, he says, "He gives me cheap labor." And notice he's got his hand close to his heart. He's tipping his cap and appears to be bowing to the immigrants. So that's a very important way to draw this contractor. He gives me cheap labor. So he is somebody that is very much desirable because he is saving money for the contractor, for the business owner, by keeping his wages low. And he's very, very happy about that, bowing in respect to this cheap source of labor. And then, of course, Uncle Sam in the background says, "He is brawn and muscle for my country." And Uncle Sam's kind of rubbing his hands together, sort of greedily, hungrily, happily. Maybe perhaps the immigrant could be used as soldiers for the army. Lots of Irish immigrants right off the boat were put right into the Civil War. So Uncle Sam seems to be relatively happy. He's brawn and muscle. He's a hard worker. He's possibly a fighter. He's someone that can make my country strong. So let's take a look at a couple of groups and talk a little bit about some of these anti-immigrant attitudes that we see specifically here towards the Irish. So there'll be a very strong anti-Irish sentiment developing in the United States between the 1840s and 50s as a large influx of Irish immigrants come to the United States. As Catholics, that was definitely seen as a threat to a mostly Protestant United States of America. And like most immigrants, we are looking at them as a threat to jobs and a threat to wages, and that Irish workers would come to America and would reduce the wages of good white American workers and take the jobs of good white American workers. So the Irish were one of many groups that are going to be targeted and drawn in ways in our political cartoons that suggest all of the different stereotypes that we have of these groups of people. This is from a cartoon by Thomas Nast in 1871 titled The Usual Irish Way of Doing Things. And we have the Irishman here sitting on top of Uncle Sam's gunpowder, holding a torch and swinging a bottle of rum. Probably not the smartest thing to be doing, right? Feel free to pause the video and read some of the language in the background and the text underneath the cartoon, and you can learn a little bit more about some of these anti-Irish attitudes. From the New York Times in May of 1855, we can see some advertisements here for chambermaids and cooks. And if you look at some of the language here, it does include the phrase "no Irish need apply," which you would see popping up every once in a while. And then this political cartoon from San Francisco in the 1860s shows the great fear of the period that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners. So as immigration increases, we see this fear in many nativist Americans. And literally Uncle Sam being devoured by an Irish immigrant on the left and a Chinese immigrant on the right, who then eventually devours the Irish as well as the Americans, which could be an indication of maybe we're more afraid of Chinese immigrants than we are of Irish immigrants. So speaking of Chinese immigrants, let's take a look at some anti-Chinese sentiments, mostly out on the west coast of the United States, because that's where Chinese immigrants came. Many Chinese immigrants came and settled out west to work on the railroad and in gold and silver mines, many of them opening businesses like laundries and restaurants, which makes sense because a lot of men who had gone out west to work on the railroads and work in the mines really wouldn't know how to cook food or to wash their own clothes. Chinese took an opportunity to open these businesses and provide those services to a mostly male population out west in these territories. Chinese men were labeled as what were called birds of passages, that they would come to the United States, they would make money, and they would go back home, which was seen as a negative of them being here. So much so that eventually in California, the Working Man's Party was formed to specifically run for office to stop Chinese immigration from coming into the United States. Now, we're not going to go into a long history of any anti-Chinese attitudes here in America, but Chinese immigrants did face extreme discrimination as well as acts of violence. In 1871, in San Francisco, there was a race riot that killed 19 Chinese men and boys. And in 1885, in Rock Springs, Wyoming, 28 Chinese were killed by a gang of white miners. Okay, so again, we have open violence and mistreatment of people because they are Chinese. The advertisement you see on the screen for the magic washer features some pretty strong anti-Chinese sentiment, as well as some pretty overtly stereotypical images of Chinese people living here in the United States. And again, the Working Man's Party of California had one objective, which was to literally boot the Chinese out of California and out of the West Coast and kick them back over the Pacific Ocean to China. The WASP, a political magazine from the West Coast in San Francisco, shows the Chinese worker with all of these hands being very industrious, taking all of the jobs. The caption of the cartoon says, "What shall we do with our boys?" And off to the right, outside of the building, we have a young man being dragged away off to San Quentin prison. So with the Chinese taking all these jobs, our white young men will be unemployed and they'll get into trouble, and they'll end up in a reform school or a reformatory or in prison. Thomas Nast also produced this cartoon showing Colombia protecting a Chinese immigrant. Again, you can pause the video and read some of the language behind her there on the wall. Again, common statements and attitudes towards the Chinese. And then from the WASP magazine, again, a political cartoon called The Coming Man, showing the Chinese gaining a monopoly over all of these jobs and industries out in California. And again, the overtly stereotypical way of drawing these people does not help to tone down some of these nativist attitudes. Well, this political movement against the Chinese is definitely going to gain ground, and by the 1870s and 1880s, there is a very strong movement to exclude the Chinese, to actually stop immigration from China from happening. And that's going to happen in 1882 with the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So Congress passes an Exclusion Act signed by President Arthur, which bans all Chinese immigration into the U.S. for 10 years. In 1892, 10 years later, that ban was extended with the Gary Act. And then 10 years after that, the ban was expanded to include Hawaii and the Philippines. So any Chinese immigrant moving to Hawaii, then trying to come to the United States, or going to the Philippines, and then trying to come to the United States would also be excluded. And this exclusion of Chinese immigration is going to last until 1943, when it's eventually dropped during World War II as China became an ally of the United States against the Axis powers. But for the better part of about 60 years, immigration from China was essentially ended. And then the Gentleman's Agreement in 1907 is based upon America's also increasing anti-Japanese attitudes. In 1905, a Japanese and Korean Exclusion League was formed. And in 1906, the school board of the city of San Francisco announced that it had planned to segregate schools, keeping Asian students or students of Asian descent in separate schools from white citizens. This led to a huge outcry and a lot of anger in the Japanese government. This was eventually settled by President Roosevelt, who convinced the schools in San Francisco not to segregate, but in return, Japan had to agree to not issue any passports for Japanese immigrants to the United States. And this is known as the Gentleman's Agreement, which essentially ends immigration from Japan into the United States as well. So, this is a very quick look at immigration and some attitudes towards immigrants during this progressive period of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So some takeaways from today's lesson. Number one, America's industrialization led to a mass influx of immigrants. Those immigrants coming from different parts of Europe and different parts of the world that they hadn't previously come from before. Number two, those that came to America had many pushes that motivated them to leave their countries, as well as many pulls, bringing them here to the United States with so many advantages that they didn't have back home. Mass immigration is going to begin to change America's ethnic and cultural identity. And for many people, that was very upsetting and very challenging, especially in urban areas where you would see a lot of immigrants settling. The new immigrants were culturally different than many native-born white Americans, and those differences are going to create negative reactions. Those nativist attitudes will be based on prejudices, and discrimination is going to emerge against these immigrants, leading to two pieces of legislation in 1892, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and 1907, the Gentleman's Agreement, ending immigration from China as well as from Japan. I encourage you to go out and learn so much more about these topics. They are very, very interesting, and we just don't have the time to cover all of it in all the detail here. But I hope this lesson taught you something, and I hope it encouraged you to learn some more. Take care.